All right, everybody. Welcome back to another reading hour. My mistake. I had forgotten to put all the description, like the links to all these books, in the description of the podcast episodes when I was uploading these in audio format. So I'll make a note to do that in the future. But again, if you want the links to any of these books to follow along or read ahead, the link is youtube.com/@tcotepod/streams, and the link is in the links are in the description for all the YouTube videos. All right, so let's get back into the Gladio book. So we left off yesterday talking about the Solidarity Crisis is the next section here. On March 28th, 1981, Solidarity mounted the largest strike in the history of the Soviet Union in protest of the beating of 4 Polish workers by the Communist Security Service. So again, Solidarity is this organization in Poland that the Polish Pope was giving tons and tons of money to, like an inordinate amount of money through the Vatican. So it was like one of these Gladio adjacent orgs. So it would make sense why they would stage a strike in the Soviet Union. They're an anti-communist org, even if they are a labor org. Between 12 and 14 million Poles took part in the protest. A general strike to shut down all labor and commerce was set for March 30. The Soviets, in response, planned an invasion. The strikers, however, were not afraid. They believed a report from a French diplomat that the Pope would leave Vatican City to stand with his people against the invaders. At that last moment, Walesa received a letter from John Paul II, who condemned the union's intransigence and asked for the strikers to return to work. Womp womp, uh-oh. The effects of this communication were immediate. The general strike was called off. Walesa toned down his inflammatory rhetoric, and Solidarity became greatly weakened as a force in Polish affairs. A few days after this decision was made, Walesa told interviewers, "The Pope wrote to us and the primate." Who is the primate? Pleading for reason and reflection. "Tomorrow we may achieve more, but we may not go to the brink. At the same time, I know what is good today may turn out tomorrow to be bad." And the historians, when they come to judge, may say, quote, "But he was crazy. The authorities were bluffing. They were weak. Their bark was worse than their bite. It would have been possible at long last to put the country straight. They could have won, and they flunked it. They can judge me like that in 10 or 50 years. And we don't yet know if I was right, or if those who took the other view. In my opinion, the risk was too great." It's just kind of sounds like he's over explaining there, but whatever. He's trying to do the in before. It's like, it actually doesn't matter, dude. If you say that you could be wrong, people will still judge you for being wrong, unfortunately. The next section here is bad timing. The Pope's timing could not have been worse for Gladio. In Belgium, plans were being drawn for the Brabant massacre, which would result in the killing of 8 people, including an entire family. The same unit was training for an attack on a police station in the sleepy southern Belgian town of Vilsalm, where they would steal weapons in order to plant them among communist agitators. So yeah, this is also something I think Matt Chrisman, in his episode of Inebriated Past on Chapo Trap House, he like did a whole hour just like talking about Gladio, reading through some notes, and he had mentioned like these attacks at Belgium. I think this might be the one that was like on a grocery store, and they just like shot up innocent people, and like he said here, an entire family. Yeah, really horrific stuff that was obviously like Gladio ops, and then they used this to blame the left. Like they would blame the militant left for these operations that made no sense for any kind of leftist org to commit, but it was a way for them to demonize them and keep essentially the literal fascist structures in place in all these Western European countries. In Spain, the Gladio unit continued to hunt down and assassinate the leading members of the Basque separatist movement. In France, the secret army was preparing to murder Marseille police inspector Jacques Massy and his entire family, since Massy had launched an investigation into drug trafficking in Gladio. So I don't know if that means that him saying here that they're preparing to do it, if that is already something that is like, obviously it's in the past, so I don't know if that means they're going to be successful and he's just like foreshadowing it here, or if something's going to obstruct those plans, but we will see. In Germany, the Gladio unit under Heinz Lemke had launched a major attack in Munich. The weapons used in the attack came from a large arms dump in the Lindenberger Heide district. In Italy, the gladiators had just completed the Bologna bombing. Yeah, so these guys are prolific. They are very active. They are very busy doing a bunch of terrorist shit that they can blame on the left. But nowhere was Gladio at a more decisive stage than in Turkey. Okay, so terror in Turkey is the next section here. In 1980, General Kenan Evren, the commander of the counter-guerrillas, a Gladio unit, had staged a coup that toppled the government of Bülent Ecevit and the Democratic Left Party. Upon hearing the news, President Jimmy Carter phoned Paul Henze, the CIA station chief in Ankara, and said with great relief, quote, "Your people have made the coup." Henze confirmed with enthusiasm, quote, "Yes, our boys have done it." The takeover did not really come as a surprise to Carter. Before the coup, Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, had said, quote, "For Turkey, a military government would be the best solution." No wonder Turkey is such like a militant, kind of right-wing country now. The U.S. has kept it that way for a long time. Upon assuming power, Evren dissolved Turkey's parliament and suspended legislation governing the civil liberties and human rights of Turkish citizens, stating that such acts were needed to establish political stability. But the violence did not come to an end. It was transferred from the streets to the prisons. Thousands were tortured while incarcerated. Dozens were executed and scores remained missing. The coup was successful due to the intensive training the Gladio units, including the youth division of counter-guerrilla, known as the Grey Wolves, had received in sabotage, bombing, killing, torture, and rigging elections. Yeah, this is literally how you set up puppet governments and have people just operating under total delusions of democracy. This training was conducted at paramilitary centers set up by the CIA in Ankara, Bolu, Kayseri, Buka near Izmir, Kanakkale, and Cyprus. Select officers were sent for advanced training at Fort Benning in Georgia and the Ensenada Naval Base near the Mexican border. Okay. So yeah, this is like when people fantasize about doing like special ops shit or operators and all that kind of shit, like this is the kind of thing you're sent to do. Wolves eat dogs is the next section. Throughout the 1970s, counter-guerrilla and the Grey Wolves were responsible for ongoing terror attacks in Turkey that resulted in the deaths of over 5,000 students, teachers, trade union leaders, booksellers, and politicians. Also, even booksellers. They were going after quite literally anybody. Very cool of them. Sorry, I gotta block some bots here again. At the time of the coup, there were 1,700 organizations of Grey Wolves throughout Turkey. Total membership reached 200,000 members, and the movement had millions of admirers. Although Evren expressed fear of the wolves, the CIA unleashed them to fight the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, formed in 1978. The PKK sought to establish a Marxist-Leninist state in a swath of land encompassing eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, northwestern Iran, and northeastern Syria, which they called Kurdistan, land of the Kurds. Okay, so I guess that's why this is so controversial for the U.S. And it's funny now that like Marxists, like anti-imperialists, don't seem to support the Kurds or in their like efforts to build a Kurdistan, which I can only assume means that like in the time since they tried to do this and now they've been like probably subsumed to the U.S. interests as like some kind of surrogate. I don't know though. That's just what I've heard. The wolves were also deployed against the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, ASALA or Asala, a group dedicated to putting an end to NATO imperialism. Based trained in the Beirut camps of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Asala was responsible for the assassination of at least 36 Turkish diplomats. Getting shit done, well. Both groups represented an obstruction to Gladio's creation of a New World Order. The key to gaining control of northern Eurasia, according to Brzezinski and other members of the Trilateral Commission, remained Turkey, once the heart of the Great Ottoman Empire. The Central Asian republics Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan all shared a common Turkish heritage and a common Islamic faith. Although they remained part of the Soviet Union, the republics, in the eyes of geostrategists, could easily be united under a pan-Turkish banner. Okay, well, literally doing that thing where white people come in and draw straight lines on the maps. Fuck whoever lives there. Fuck the ethnic conflicts or whatever sectarian conflicts might happen as a result. Whatever. The wolves howl is the next section here. The pan-Turkish banner was unfurled by the Grey Wolves, who published their statements of belief in Bozkurt, their official newsletter. Quote, "Who are we? We are the Grey Wolves, Bozkurtku. What is our ideology? The Turkism of the Grey Wolf or Bozkurt. What is the creed of the Bozkurtku? We believe that the Turkish race and the Turkish nation are superior." Okay, how original. What is the source of this superiority? The Turkish blood. Are the Bozkurtku pan-Turks? Yes, it is the holy aim of the Bozkurt Turks to see that the Turkish nation grows to a nation of 65 million. What justification do you have for this? The Bozkurtku have long declared their principles on this issue. You do not receive right, you get it yourself. War? Yes, war, if necessary. I love just asking yourself these questions and then answering them. War is a great holy principle of nature. We are the sons of warriors. The Bozkurtku believe that war, militarism, and heroism should receive the highest esteem and praise. Okay, so that's, I guess, all quoted from the Bozkurt, their official newsletter. Cool, very cool. Not very original, just your standard boilerplate fascist shit. Believing this credo would unite Central Asia, the wolves became the favored lapdogs of the bureaucrats at Langley, and untold billions were spent upon the pack. Although the Turkish people in large numbers esteemed the wolves, they remained blissfully unaware of Gladio, let alone that the right-wing youth group was a stay-behind unit. In 1978, Dogan Oz, a public prosecutor in Ankara, uncovered the existence of such units and issued the following report to President Ecevit. There is such an organization. It includes people from security forces, such as the Army and the Secret Service. During the First and Second National Front governments in particular, they largely adopted the state mechanisms to their own purposes. The ultimate aim is to introduce a fascist system in Turkey with all the associated organs. So yeah, literally a Turkish deep state intent on running the government in a fascist manner, regardless of what it is professed to ostensibly be. Within days of issuing this warning, Oz was gunned down and killed in front of his house. There were several witnesses, and Ibrahim Siftki, leader of the Wolves, was arrested and sentenced to death. The military Supreme Court immediately overturned the verdict, and Siftki was returned to his lair. Oh my God! A similar scenario took place for several years later, when Haluk Kirsi, a wolf known as Idi Amin, was arrested for participating in the murder of Oz. He too was tried, convicted, and sentenced to execution 7 times, only to be, quote, conditionally released from Bursa prison. Sentenced to execution 7 times? What does that mean? Like, you were tried 7 times? Did they not have double, triple, quadruple jeopardy in Turkey? Reasonable expenses is the next section here. The CIA's financial support for the wolves was also necessitated by the need to protect the Balkan route and the flow of heroin into the Anatolian plains from Afghanistan and Iran, said to be worth $3 million an hour. Holy shit. Yeah, these are the kind of interests you're dealing with, folks. If you don't have some kind of party or organization that can take on people who are this well funded and are dealing with this level of corruption, trafficking, and just wealth created from these infrastructures and entire like trade systems that they have created and maintained for decades. If you can't compete with that, like, your org is just not serious. You need a state. They also safeguarded the smuggling of weapons into the country. The scale of this smuggling may be discerned from the fact that the following illegal arms were confiscated in Turkey between 1980 and 1984: 638,000 revolvers, 4,000 submachine guns, 48,000 rifles, 7,000 machine guns, 26 rocket launchers, and 1 mortar. Just 1 mortar? 1 mortar for the hell of it? The wolves were so integral to the drugs for arms enterprise that it became almost impossible to make a clear-cut distinction between this Gladio unit, the Turkish Mafia, and Turkey's National Intelligence Operation, or MIT, a so-called unofficial arm of the CIA. All 3 organizations were interlocked in Ergenekon, a clandestine ultra-nationalist movement that operated as a shadow state. Okay, so that's what they're calling, I guess, the Turkish deep state that is implementing this fascist government. Very cool. What's going on, Tim Price? What's going on, Shibbles? Good to see you guys. So let's see. Continuing here. The bastard son is his next section. Ergenekon was the bastard son of Gladio, the illegitimate offspring of U.S. intelligence and the Babas that would come to direct many of the critical events in Turkey and Central Asia into the 21st century. In many ways, it represented the culmination of the dreams of Alan Dulles, William Donovan, Paul Hellawell, and James Jesus Angleton. Yeah, these are like the notorious guys that started all of Gladio decades and decades before this. Ergenekon enabled street thugs, assassins, and drug lords to act with impunity. Even if incarcerated, such criminals had little to fear. Ergenekon could arrange their escape. It could create false identities. It could arrange the transfer of large sums of cash. After its formation in 1978, Ergenekon, by controlling the heroin trade from the Golden Triangle, became worth more than 20% of Turkey's earned income. Crazy. Crazy amounts of money, crazy amounts of power, crazy amounts of corruption and connections, crazy amounts of, like, quite literal material ability derived from arms and materiel. Wild how much they are able to get done And I'm trying to translate this in terms of like what would a left-wing vanguard party that had this kind of capability even look like? It's like imagine having like drug routes that you created, and then having like compliant players in every level of law enforcement and state apparatus that would try to shut you down or investigate you in any way. Having players in all of the media, like it's like the communist wet dream. It's what the fascists think is going on. Uh, but yeah, it's what is actually has been. That's literally the world we live in and have lived in our entire lives since the end of World War II. It's just like a fascist. What do you call it? Like they won. Like they just the Nazis proclaimed to have lost World War II, but obviously were instilled into so many places of power in so many countries that they absolutely did not. They just turned into a drug smuggling and arms supplying, clandestine underground governmental deep state organization that operates worldwide in the West, outside of like Russia, China, Iran, the countries they're hostile towards. Nurturing cubs. Throughout the 1970s, Henry P. Shart, that's your name, dude, Schart, Henry P. Shart, Dewey Claridge, and other CIA operatives in Turkey allegedly had nurtured several of Abu Zer Usurlu's wolf cubs, including Abdullah Katli and Mehmet Ali Agsa. Kath, who became the vice chairman of the Wolves, performed scores of high-profile assassinations, including the murder of 7 left-wing activists in 1978. Working with the agency, he became an agent provocateur in the 1980 coup. Agsa began his criminal career as a drug smuggler on the Balkan route. He rose to become one of Ogurlu's trusted couriers, making regular trips to deliver messages and payments to Henry Arsan at Stybum in Milan. Eventually, he became one of the Baba's bodyguards and hitmen, working with Kath and Oral Gelik. What the hell's an Oral? Oh, and Oral Gelik. I thought that's that guy's name, Oral Gelik. I thought that was like a role, and it was like an oral storyteller of some kind. Killing Ipeki. The next section here. On February 1st, 1979, Agsa took part in the murder of Abdi Ipeki, the editor-in-chief of Milliyet, one of Turkey's leading daily newspapers. When taken into custody, Agsa quickly confessed, saying, "Yes, I shot and killed Ipeki. I was alone, and I fired 4 or 5 times." But there was a problem with this testimony. A total of 13 spent cartridges were found at the scene of the crime. Ipeki was one of Turkey's most distinguished journalists, and his assassination shocked the nation. Agsa received a life sentence and was incarcerated in an Istanbul prison. After serving 6 months, he, quote, escaped wearing an army uniform. There was, in fact, no flight. He simply strolled from the jail in August 1979 with Abdullah Kath as his escort. The Babas needed him to get back to work. Crazy. Just wild, wild levels of blatant, rampant corruption here. And it's like when you have like the situation like we're experiencing here in the US where like Trump is just flip-flopping on Epstein 6 or 7 times, getting his own base to abandon him, it seems, but like it's not going to lead to anything as far as like accountability. It's not going to take him down. And we have this like situation where people start asking like, how is this happening? Like, how are we going through this level of like blatant corruption and malfeasance from our government and no one's doing anything? It's like, yeah, it can get even worse. It can get even more blatant. It can get way worse, and you will still do fucking nothing if you don't have a vanguard party. The ideal candidate, next section here. 3 days after his escape, Agsa wrote a letter to Milliyet. So, oh my God, imagine being this ballsy. Like, you escape after assassinating like one of their most prominent journalists, and then you write them a letter being like, hey, yeah, fuck you. Let's see what he says. He wrote a letter to Milliyet, which made it clear that he was the perfect choice for a hit on the Holy Father. He wrote, quote, fearing that Turkey is attempting to realize a new political, military, and economic power with its Islamic brother countries in the Middle East during this highly sensitive time. This is the assassin saying this. The Western imperialists are sending John Paul, who behind his religious mask is a commander of the cross, with all speed to Turkey. If this senseless and poorly timed visit is not canceled, then I will not hesitate to shoot the Pope. Wow, dude. You're just sending this to the newspaper. Cool. This is the only reason I escaped from prison. Revenge will certainly be taken for an attack on Mecca by the United States and Israel. Agsa was not only an experienced assassin who already had spewed his hatred of John Paul II, but also a radical Islamist and pan-Turkish visionary who longed for the return of the Ottoman Empire. Even better, he suffered paranoid delusions, at times professing that he was Jesus Christ. Wow, dude. Got some real winners here. This is crazy stuff. Wild, wild stuff, folks. All right, I'm at 19... I'll read like one more section here, and then I'll bookmark the Gladio book. So this next section is the Gladio Directive. Early in April 1981, Abu Zer Ugurlu received word from Gladio, kill the Pope and blame the communists. It was to be the ultimate false flag attack. The message came with a payment of $1.7 million. The arrangements had been made by members of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, P2, and the Safari Club, a covert organization that had been established by Henry Kissinger. The gunmen would be Katli and Agsa. Cool. Very cool stuff. Okay. So, yeah, I will leave it off there. We are up to chapter 16 now. Where we'll pick up tomorrow is, chapter 16, The Shooting in St. Peter's Square. Okay. All right, so now we will switch over to the Western Marxism book. Once again, this is Western Marxism by Domenico Losurdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. And again, links are in the description if you want to follow along or read ahead or share with anyone else. Let's read now the two authors of Empire. Quote, "From India to Algeria, from Cuba to Vietnam, the state is the poisoned gift of national liberation." Again, like, just real quick, that's like the Western Marxist point of view, that all states are equally oppressive, equally corrupted by power. There can be no such state that works for the people, that is democratic in nature, that actually is governed by the majority of like working class people. And they also only apply this especially to states that the Western imperialist alliance is antagonistic towards. And then they say that those places should be more anarchist, should have less government, should have less of any kind of state apparatus, and that would be better for the people. And then they support the U.S. overthrowing democratically elected governments and then call themselves anti-imperialists. But anyway, continuing. Yes, the Palestinians can count on the sympathy and support of Western Marxism, but from the moment in which, quote, the Palestinians are institutionalized, one can, quote, no longer be at their side. The fact is that, quote, as soon as the nation begins to form as a sovereign state, its progressive functions all but vanish. And so we can be sympathetic to the Chinese, Vietnamese, Palestinians, or any other people only so long as they are oppressed, humiliated, and without any power. That is, as long as they are in the hands of colonialism and imperialism. We can support their struggle for national liberation only as long as it continues to be defeated. The defeat or the inconclusiveness of a revolutionary movement is the precondition for certain exponents of Western Marxism to celebrate themselves and enjoy being rebels, who in any circumstance refuse to contaminate themselves with constituted power. The tendency described here has found a home in a recent book, which has been quite successful among Western Marxists and whose title invites us to, quote, change the world without taking power. Perfect. That couldn't be a better title and sentiment to give, to like inseminate among people that you want to continue to oppress, to tell them that they can change the world without taking any power, and then have them actually believe that shit. To renounce power, to concentrate on the critique of the existing order, and avoid the distractions and compromises that the prospect of taking power inevitably leads to, seems a noble and high-flying approach. But in light of this new truth, how small seem retrospectively the great struggles of the colonial peoples, the subaltern classes, and women to end the three great forms of discrimination, race, class, and gender, that excluded these three groups from enjoying political rights and the possibility of influencing the composition and direction of the organs of power. Small also appear the struggles for emancipation of the colonial peoples that, among other things, were clearly struggles for power. And no less small, then, are the struggles for emancipation of our own times. There are many, even beyond those on the left, that denounce the fact that in the West, democracy has been revealed to always be more of a plutocracy. The power of great wealth and finance that can avail itself of an electoral system that, in varying ways, makes it difficult or impossible for the popular classes to gain control of the representative organs and of the highest political offices. What does all this matter if the real problem is to, quote, change the world without taking power? Plutocracy also makes itself felt internationally. Churchill acknowledged this in his own time when he said, quote, the government of the world must be entrusted to satisfied nations, who wish nothing more for themselves than what they have. If the world government were in the hands of hungry nations, there would always be danger. Danger for you, danger for the exploiters, danger for the people who live on their backs and their exploited labor. In organs like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, it is the masters of yesterday and today who make the law. These forces seek to exclude even the UN, demanding for the West alone, quote, the satisfied nations of which Churchill spoke, the power to unleash war in every corner of the globe, even without authorization by the UN Security Council. The new truth proclaimed by Holloway is, in fact, the truth of religions. Immediately after the defeat of the Jewish National Revolution, crushed by Roman imperialism, Jesus proclaimed, quote, my kingdom is not of this world. The self-dissolution of Western Marxism here is reconfigured as the abandonment of the terrain of politics and is ending up in religion. Hell yeah. Yeah, I've been saying that for a while. Politics in the West, like leftism in the West, is more like a religion where entry to the club is predicated on whether or not you just believe certain things. Doesn't matter what you're doing. You could work for Lockheed Martin, but if you're like vegan, or if you like just believe that everybody should have health care, even if you do nothing to that end to make that come about, or even if you just believe that it should happen under the capitalist government rather than after a socialist revolution that changes the system of political economy, um, then you're just in the club. You're a leftist. You're a Western Marxist. Part 6 here, the struggle against the phrase, from Robespierre to Lenin. Moreover, the discomfort and diffidence toward power are not manifest only in the West. In Russia, the adversaries of Marxism criticized its followers, even the most revolutionary, for being only talkers incapable of governing and running a country, and so inclined to seek refuge from the responsibilities of power. On the immediate eve of the October Revolution, to convince his own party comrades to overcome their hesitations, Lenin, in an article, reported on the derisory portrait that the adversaries of the Bolsheviks painted of them. Quote, "The Bolsheviks, except for a few fanatics, are brave only in words. They would not attempt to take, quote, full power on their own accord. Disorganizers and disruptors par excellence, they are really cowards who in their heart of hearts are fully aware of both their own intrinsic ignorance and the ephemeral nature of their present successes. Irresponsible by their very nature, anarchists in method and practice, they should be regarded only as a trend of political thought, or rather as one of its aberrations." So wait, Lenin is writing that, mocking what he's like doing a Seeing Red segment. That's very funny. But he's writing. He's not even like going onto like what is the Reddit of the time to find the bad opinions. He's just like he's just writing it himself. Very funny. He does a good job. He's scathing. Knowing how things turned out, we can smile today at this portrait, but we must not forget its history. For centuries, conservative and liberal cultures have denounced the, quote, abstractness of intellectual supporters of radical social and political transformation. To nurture utopias and dreams of social palingenesis. I don't know what palingenesis means. The recurring theme of the liberal conservative indictment is social palingenesis, like just everybody coming together as one and just doing like a John Lennon kind of everybody love each other revolution. And that's the recurring theme of the liberal conservative indictment. Anyway, to nurture utopias and dreams of social palingenesis, the recurring theme of the liberal conservative indictment, can only be the work of intellectuals with no experience exercising power. Indeed, neither do they have any experience in the administration of large private property. They were, at best, good-for-nothings who made a living by their education and were immersed in an artificial world of books, ideas, and utopias never put to the test of reality and practice. They were, quote, beggars of the pen, according to Burke's disparaging definition. So how could they expect to govern a state or exercise a task beyond their abilities? However self-interested and full of classist spirit it might be, this criticism is not without some truth. There is no doubt that the propertied intellectuals arrived at their appointment with the crisis of the ancien regime, having some real experience of the exercise of power. In the U.S. Revolution, the slave owners played a disproportionate role, such that in the first decades of its existence, the North American Republic saw an almost uninterrupted series of slave owners hold the presidency. Yeah. People, I don't think pay enough attention to that fact. Before the foundation of the new state, they were not limited to enjoying their slaves as a species of quote, peculiar private property alongside their other property. They had exercised legislative, judicial, and executive power over their slaves. They arrived well prepared for the exercise of political power in the strict sense. Analogous considerations hold for liberal England as well. Property in slaves was not absent, though the latter were located across the sea. But it was great landowners that set the tone for the House of Lords and of Commons in the liberal culture. And they, given the social relations of the time, exercised some form of power over the peasants, such that they sometimes, as happened in particular in the case of the gentry, the small nobility, they held a position of justice of the peace, and so held judiciary power. All told, the two liberal revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic saw the rise to power of classes that had a consolidated practice of administration and governing. Yeah, it's almost like the U.S. system, although it was supposed to be revolutionary and a break from the monarchy, ended up being still consolidating power in this landowning, property, and slave-owning class. The picture changes radically with the French Revolution, above all in its Jacobin phase, and with the October Revolution. In 1794, it was obviously not the slave owners who abolished slavery, but rather the beggars of the pen, the quote, abstract intellectuals, who just for this reason were deaf to the appeals and calculations of the owners of human beasts. And in 1917, those calling on the quote, slaves of the colonies to break their chains were not the beneficiaries of colonial exploitation, but their antagonists. Yet again, the quote, abstract intellectuals. Yeah. All right, let me just check the chat here. Always got to check and see if I have to block bots. However, the merits of these social figures should not blind us to their limitations. Robespierre was forced to polemicize against the champions of exporting the revolution, thinking thereby to bring about a definitive victory, quote, over despotism and universal aristocracy, defeating it by oratory, tribune through sublime thought, and figures of rhetoric. Robespierre was forced to do this? Damn. Sounds very pussy. Refusing to support the humiliating Pact of Brest-Litovsk, which the German imperialism of Wilhelm II imposed on Soviet Russia, seizing a conspicuous part of its national territory, a significant part of the Bolshevik Party, without considering the extreme weakness of Soviet Russia at the moment, dreamed of a European, quote, revolutionary war that would have resolved everything and made difficult choices unnecessary. I mean, yeah, that would be ideal if, like, things had played out like Marx and Engels and all the Marxists had wanted, that, like, Europeans had some kind of, like, revolutionary energy, movement, serious, like, militant organizations toward that end. But other than, like, the French Jacobins that you're talking about, there really wasn't, and they only got so far. Lenin's irony was biting in response. We can't confront a very powerful enemy through, quote, unrestrained phrase-making, by being intoxicated by phrases. And so, quote, we shall set about preparing a revolutionary army, not by phrases and exclamations. Hell yeah, dude. In the end, quote, revolutionary phrases only express, quote, feelings, desires, anger, and indignation. Yeah. Seems very obvious, right? But those who see in every compromise with imperialism an abdication of the revolution and morality reply, quote, in the interests of the world revolution, we consider it expedient to accept the possibility of losing Soviet power, which is now becoming purely formal. These are words Lenin described as, quote, strange and monstrous. He took a position on them by denouncing the persistent attitude of intellectuals inclined to see in power, with all the compromises that it inevitably entails, a source of moral contamination, and who tended to prefer the role of outside opposition, quote, critical, but substantially unrealistic, just as, not entirely wrongly, the liberal and conservative circles had insinuated even on the eve of October. Yeah, again, biting, scathing, dead on, and, like, not even too wordy. He just, like, cuts right to the point of it and nails these guys for exactly what they are. So in the very moment of the formation of the Communist International, the abstractions of revolutionary intellectuals made themselves felt, East and West, but at a certain point, the bifurcation between them appeared. In the East, having taken power, intellectuals and ex-intellectuals were forced to commit themselves to a trying apprenticeship. In March 1920, Lenin invited the party and state cadre to learn everything necessary to not be swept away by counter-revolution. Quote, no, comrades, the art of administration does not descend from heaven. It is not inspired by the Holy Ghost. Yeah, very realistic, very historical materialist of him. Developments were quite different in the East. The messianic hopes were not realized through, quote, the transformation of power into love. But this did not change the attitude of diffidence toward power, seen as a source of intellectual and moral contamination. The bifurcation between Eastern Marxism and Western Marxism comes down to a contrast between Marxists who exercised power and Marxists who were in opposition and concentrated increasingly on, quote, critical theory, deconstruction, and denouncing power and power relations as such. Yeah, that's I feel like I should just, like, bold that. It's like the bifurcation between Eastern Marxism and Western Marxism comes down to a contrast between Marxists who exercise power and Marxists who were in opposition and concentrated increasingly on, quote, critical theory, deconstruction, and denouncing power and power relations as such. Yeah, it's basically like the fucking winners versus the losers, the teachers versus the doers. A, quote, Western Marxism thus took shape, which, in its distance from power, claimed the privilege and exclusive right to rediscover a quote, an authentic Marxism, no longer reduced to state ideology. Is this claim justified? If in one respect they may increase the clarity of vision, distance from power and disdain toward it can also obstruct vision. Undoubtedly, the challenges of leading a country strongly helped Lenin, Mao, and other leaders, and Eastern Marxism as a whole, to let go of messianic expectations and develop a more realistic vision of building a post-capitalist society. With this persistent attachment to the quote phrase, Western Marxism has ended up representing two figures that are the main targets of Hegel's criticism. Since critique is satisfying, and indeed in critique one finds one's reason for being, without posing the problem of formulating practical alternatives and of building an alternative historic block to the dominant one, it is the very image of the conceit of what ought to exist, which, when one then enjoys the distance from power as a condition of one's own purity, this embodies the beautiful soul. I'm not familiar with the beautiful soul uh, concept from Hegel. I'm sure somebody in the chat will be very familiar, hopefully will enlighten us. But yeah, I mean, it's just like describing that exact difference between Eastern Marxism, between the critics and the people who are actually exercising power. And I can think of no better example today than the anti-imperialist bloc. Like, he's literally describing like an alternative bloc to the dominant imperialist one. And if you don't support that, if you don't think that that's the dominant like anti-imperialist thing happening right now, it's the only hope that historical materialists and anti-imperialists have. Uh, if you don't understand that, like, you're literally still blinded by Western propaganda. So 7, War and the Death Certificate of Western Marxism. Reduced to a religion, and indeed a religion of evasion, Western Marxism cannot provide an answer to the problems of the present, particularly to the worsening of the international situation. We have seen what has happened in the past few years. On the occasion of the war against Libya in 2011, authoritative organs of the Western press recognized its neocolonial character. Neocolonial and bloody. An eminent French philosopher, very distant from Marxism, observed, quote, "Today we know that the war resulted in at least 30,000 deaths against 300 victims of the initial repression carried out by Gaddafi. According to other estimates, the toll of the NATO intervention would be even greater. And the tragedy continues. The country has been destroyed, and people have been forced to choose between desperation at home or fleeing to the unknown, which could be fatal. I am not aware of any exponent of Western Marxism or of, quote, libertarian Western Marxism that denounced this horror. Indeed, a personality such as Rossana Rossanda, who, as the founder of the communist daily Il Manifesto, can be included in the category of, quote, Western Marxism or libertarian Western Marxism, went to the very threshold of calling for armed intervention against Gaddafi's Libya. It is a threshold that Susanna Camuso, Secretary General of the CGIL, a union federation that has left long behind its one-time links to the Communist Party and to Eastern Marxism, happily crossed over. How did we get to this point? At the moment of the outbreak of the first war against Iraq, while the Italian Communist Party was dissolving itself, one of its illustrious philosophers, Giacomo Maramo, stated in its party newspaper Unità on January 25th, 1991, quote, "Throughout history, it has never happened that a democratic state made war against another democratic state." Wow, that's a bold claim. Big if true. In reality, the two countries that love to celebrate themselves as the oldest democracies in the world, Great Britain and the United States, were already at war at the moment of the crisis that resulted in the founding of the North American Republic, and they again clashed a few decades later in another war, the War of 1812. Fought with such fury that, as we know, Jefferson called it, quote, "a war of extermination." Even if we admit that democratic states live side by side in peace with one another, does this make irrelevant the genocide that the Democratic Republic of North America carried out against the native peoples? Or the genocide the British Empire engaged in against natives of Australia and New Zealand? On the other hand, was it not Tocqueville, the great theoretician of democracy, who revealed the true face of the colonial wars of the liberal democratic West when he called for genocidal practices against the Algerian population? Already refuted by Togliatti at the start of the Cold War, the myth expressed by Maramo makes clear yet again the missed encounter between Western Marxism and the anti-colonial revolution. I mean, that is, again, one of the defining characteristics of Western Marxism, aside from just being theoretical, academic, and not an active practice, is that they just don't bother with decolonialism. All right, so I am at 40 minutes. So let me see if I'll bookmark this one here. And I'm going to switch over to the Anna Louise Strong book, The Soviets Expected It. So we left off talking about, we were talking about the fifth column yesterday. We were talking about how the Nazis were not able to install like shadow governments or gain enough secret operatives or double agents in the Soviet governments to overthrow it. Like they obviously weren't successful. So let's see. Oh, I have to switch. Sorry, almost didn't switch the tab again. So in the subsequent trials of related groups, the hand of Nazi Germany was several times exposed. Pyatakov, former chief of Soviet state industry, said that he had met Trotsky abroad in 1935 and learned that the latter had made a deal with Rudolf Hess for Nazi support in the overthrow of the Stalin regime. In return for this, Germany was to get opportunities for investments throughout Russia and a special sphere of influence in the Ukraine through a puppet state. It seems like they kind of did get that after the end of once the Soviet Union was disbanded. This is also something people constantly bring up about Trotsky, is his Nazi collaboration stuff. It sucks, man. Other indications of German plotting came almost simultaneously from an entirely different quarter in faraway Novosibirsk. In November 1936, 8 Soviet executives and 1 German engineer pled guilty to sabotage, which had wrecked coal mines and caused the death of miners. The German engineer's testimony implicated the German consul in Novosibirsk. Most of the foreign press at the time denounced the trials as a frame-up. Most foreign observers who sat at the trials found them credible, even if shocking. D.N. Pritt, a British member of parliament, wrote a pamphlet stating his convictions that the men were guilty as charged. Edward C. Carter, Secretary General of the Institute of Pacific Relations, wrote, quote, "It makes sense and is convincing. The confessions seem both normal and purposeful. The theory that it was a frame-up is untenable. It was not a device to secure removal of critics. The Kremlin's case was genuine, terribly genuine. To me, personally, as I sat in the trials, it was not so difficult to follow the path by which once revolutionary leaders had become self-confessed traitors. They had begun by doubting the Russian people's capacity to build a strong and independent state based on publicly owned enterprise. This had been the open cleavage in the party discussions in the 1920s. Their doubt was deepened by the contrast between Russia's tremendous inefficiencies and the efficient German organization they saw on their trips abroad. It was not so difficult to believe that Russia might profit by a little German discipline impressed by the iron heel. Plenty of irritated people made such remarks. Eventually, there might be a European revolution in which German workers would lead. Yeah, we could dream, right? Meantime, they would capitalize the situation to destroy the Stalin leadership they hated and bargain with Hitler for as much of Russia as they could get. Well, never mind. That would be bad. It is the deadly argument by which the Nazis have again and again secured a solid foothold among a discontented minority of the ruling group. Step by step, the investigations, arrests, and trials involved wider circles. 3 days after the first trial opened, Tomsky, former chairman of the Central Council of Trade Unions, who had been mentioned in court by one of the defendants, confessed his guilt and committed suicide rather than face arrest. A former president of the Ukraine, Lubchenko, committed suicide in the same manner. Regional trials began in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Far East. In the Tajik Republic on the borders of India, several of the highest officials were removed as, quote, enemies of the people. In the Far East, the chief of the GPU fled to Japan, and many of his subordinates were arrested as Japanese spies and wreckers. The first indication that the trial had led to the Red Army was the suicide on June 1st, 1937 of Marshal Gamarnik, chief of the Red Army's political commissars. 8 days later, Voroshilov announced that 4 important commanders, including Marshal Tukhachevsky, who had only recently been vice commissar of defense, had been removed from their posts. These 4 and additional 4 were tried by court-martial on July 11th before the military collegium of the Supreme Court, the first of the big trials to be held in secret. They pled guilty to high treason and were sentenced to death. The Moscow press announced that they had been in the pay of Hitler and had agreed to help him get the Ukraine. This charge was fairly widely believed in foreign military circles and was later substantiated by revelations made abroad. Czech officials in Prague bragged to me later that their military men had been the first to discover and to complain to Moscow that Czech military secrets, known to the Russians through the Mutual Aid Alliance, were being revealed by Tukhachevsky to the German High Command. Yeah, and there's some footnotes for this kind of stuff saying that G.E.R. Getty, Prague correspondent for the New York Times, also cabled on June 18, 1937 that, quote, 2 of the highest officials in Prague told him that they had definite knowledge for at least 6 months that secret connections between German general, oh, that gets cut off. Okay, unless it gets the German general staff and certain high Russian generals had existed ever since the Rapallo Treaty. Okay. Harold Denny in the New York Times, January 15th, 1939, wrote, quote, "In almost 5 years' residence, trying to learn the facts, I have found no evidence which I consider trustworthy that physical torture is applied to prisoners. I am convinced that there does not occur, unless in isolated and exceptional instances, the sadistic cruelties reported from German prison camps, or even the beating with rubber hoses bestowed, as every American police reporter knows, in the back rooms of many American police stations." I didn't know that was a thing they used to do, beat you with a rubber hose. Hmm. Very interesting stuff. It also like sheds a whole new light on the fucking Nazi state of Ukraine now, the present state of things, it being used as a proxy against Russia, having so many neo-Nazi militias that were so easily used by the state to wage that war, uh, their their affiliation for Bandera. Uh, what probably startled Soviet citizens most was the appalling fact that the treason trials at least implicated Yagoda, chief of the formidable GPU. It must be realized that most Soviet citizens regard their GPU, much as the Americans do the FBI, an organ which they wish to fight shy of themselves, and which occasionally goes to extremes, but which is necessary for national protection and acts on evidence. I mean, maybe that's what Americans think of it. In the old days, certainly not now. I don't know. The GPU, maybe liberals, I guess. The GPU has always disclaimed, I think truthfully, the use of Gestapo forms of torture, and even of the American third degree. Okay, so that's the rubber hose thing. In connection with the arrest of Yagoda, other arrests of local GPU officials occurred in many cities on the charge of arresting innocent citizens and using improper methods to extort confessions. They were given the severest sentences, for the crime was considered of the very gravest nature. But such arrests began to throw doubt on the whole investigating arm of the government. If that was rotten, what could be believed? Yeah, it's almost like if you are suspected even to have tortured people that are confessing things, that it throws their entire confession into doubt, doesn't really make it usable or what do you call it, like trustworthy. Even if you do use it in court, like people will doubt it. So I don't know. Seems like the U.S. did not learn that lesson. We tortured some folks. The answer was plain. In the last resort, you can trust the common people rather than any apparatus or official. The entire membership of the Communist Party was therefore subjected to what is called a quote cleansing or purge in the presence of large audiences of their non-communist fellow workers. Each communist had to relate his life history and daily activities in the presence of people who were in a position to check them. It was a brutal experience for an unpopular president of a Moscow university to explain to an examining board in the presence of his students why he merited the nation's trust, or for a superintendent of a large plant to expose his life history and daily activities, even to his wife's use of one or the other of one of the factory automobiles for shopping, in the presence of the plant's workers, any one of whom had the right to make remarks. This was done with every communist throughout the country. It resulted in the expulsion of large numbers from the party, and in the arrest and trial of a few. Yeah, I mean, imagine having that level of accountability for like your bosses, for like your local government. Imagine being able to like go through their finances and comment on it in a public forum. In March 1939, the 18th Party Congress finally abolished these general quote purges as too severe. Yeah, I guess no more struggle sessions. They had, however, firmly established the tradition that every communist must be judged by the court of his fellow workers. Okay, so struggle sessions, who have other, less spectacular ways of making their pressure known. Appeals to the quote watchfulness of the people against spies and saboteurs filled the press and became the theme of motion pictures. Pamphlets told quote how the spy acts. Quote, don't talk in the streetcars about your factory, said these pamphlets. Quote, you may be giving information that will help the enemy locate our war industries. The Soviet people understood the happy, expansive, loquacious mood that once made them so endearing was replaced by a stern mood of watchfulness and suspicious silence, especially toward foreigners. They were, quote, on guard. They shut up for the duration of the coming war. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a shame. You got to have to go from like a optimistic, like brand new country and culture and everything after a revolution to then have to be like, oh shit, now we got to clam up on a national scale too. Wild. Those years from 1937 to 38 are remembered by all Soviet citizens as a time of mental distress caused by the widespread suspicion and often unexplained arrests. The arrests affected chiefly the upper party circles and those officials dealing with foreigners. Hence, they seemed to foreigners more extensive than they were. None of the arrests was as wanton as the foreign press portrayed them. Evidence of some sort was indicated. Uh, the common sentence was not execution, but swift removal to another job in another part of the country. I'm sure the Western propagandists say, "Oh yeah, sure, you moved them to a farm upstate, right?" Fairly large numbers of such transfers seem to have occurred merely on suspicion, on the theory that if the suspects were guilty or had guilty connections, the transfer would break these up. If they were innocent, they would not suffer much from a job transfer and would come back to Moscow eventually if they chose. Naturally, such people did not hasten to communicate with their foreign acquaintances during their absence, and this often led the latter to assume that the Russians had been, quote, liquidated. Uh, did not hasten to communicate. Oh, so I guess they were not able to. Uh, oh, okay. So if they were guilty, they were not able to communicate with their foreign their other operatives. So then the other bad guys would assume that they had just been killed, right? A year or two later, large numbers of such people returned, none the worse for their temporary job in the quote sticks. Mm-hmm. So I guess they quite literally did move them to farms of state. 3 personal experiences will indicate what happened during this period to the minds and the character of the Soviet people. I spent a whole summer on the shores of the Moscow River, not far from the little suburb of Fili. I knew that there was a great industrial plant in Fili. Many times I saw Fili workers marching thousands strong with their banners in parade. Years later in New York, after the German-Soviet War began, I read in the papers that the famous six motor bombers, in some way surpassing the American quote flying fortress, are made in the Fili plant. If that is true, I know how every Fili worker must have longed to brag of it to me, an American. Nobody ever did. They were so silent that I am not yet certain whether the bomber tale is true. Once, at a May Day celebration, I learned that several score Americans were deeply disappointed because they had come to Moscow to see the demonstration, and there was no place for them in Red Square. I suggested that they might march with the staff of the Moscow Daily News, thus seeing the square in passing. The representative of the Soviet tourist agency answered, quote, "We should be very grateful if you can take them, but do you know them all well enough to give your personal guarantee that they have no pistols or bombs?" That settled it. I refused to guarantee sight unseen even my fellow countrymen. I had heard that agents of foreign countries had come to the USSR as American workers or tourists. After this, I noticed that the ranks of the Soviet workers in a demonstration will never let an outsider join them. Each group knows its fellow factory members and takes responsibility for its own ranks. Yeah, imagine having that level of community among your fellow workers, among the people like just geographically around you, to have that level of security. Once during the trials, I spoke to a Soviet friend about what I called, quote, excessive severity. I knew that his wife had lost her job for some mere laxness in trusting German agents, and that he himself had had a rather grueling time in the party cleaning. I guess one of those purges. I mentioned cases of, quote, innocent victims. He agreed that there might be such. Quote, let them take it up with their deputy, he told me. The deputies of the Supreme Soviet just now are handling lots of such complaints. People who are conscious of innocence and fight for it will eventually come back. Quote, why don't you see the basic picture, he added. Our leading economists, and some British bourgeois economists also, think that the world will crash about 1939. By crash, I mean a military crisis like that of 1914, superimposed on an economic crisis like that of 1929. It may be a half year sooner or later, but the greatest crash mankind has ever known is clearly due. So that's how long people have been saying this kind of thing. It's crazy. The coming struggle will decide whether the world must go down in the dark ages of slavery and wars, or whether mankind can win through to a decent world. Quote, in this great struggle, where is there any sure foundation? Only here in our Soviet land, where for 20 years we have been building and testing the social forms fit for a technically developed and civilized world. It would have been easier for humanity, I grant you, if the Americans had done it first. You could have organized these forms of socialism swiftly without our terrible waste motion, perhaps without the cost we pay, the cost we pay in human life. You could have swiftly built, quote, plenty for all. You didn't do it. So it is we backward peasant Russians, who have to save the world. Hell yeah. I love this guy. Oh, he goes on. What is our duty to the coming world crisis? We must come up to it with as much wheat as possible, as much iron and steel as possible, as many healthy people as possible, and as few wreckers as possible. We are going to do it. With our 2 5-year plans completed, we can do it. Those who doubt it are traitors not only to our Soviet country, but to mankind. You are concerned with these people's psychology. To hell with their psychology. Whether it is guilt or exhaustion, fine feelings or high treason, whatever spreads doubt and defeatism amongst our people, among our people must be cleaned out. Looking back at those words from the war that has broken, I know why the Soviets have no fifth column. I know what it cost them, what it would cost any nation to clean its potential fifth column out. Yeah. So I guess that's the whole thing about the purges. And that's why like people who are just anti-communist and fascist sympathizers will just say that the fifth column is like a myth, even though it's like literally how they toppled other countries. Let's see. All right, I'll go for like 5 more minutes and then we'll be wrapping it up for the day. So I'll go on to section 9 or chapter 9 here. The fight for peace fails. Sorry, I keep hitting my desk. Paradoxically enough, it took the Soviet-German war to convince certain circles in Washington that the USSR is a peace-loving land. They noted that we have not had to worry about defending Alaska in all the years that the Soviets have been our next-door neighbors, but that it would be another story if Japan or Nazi Germany should gain a foothold in the Soviet Far East. It was a belated recognition of a fact which much of the world has known. For the first 22 years of its existence, the Soviet Union gained a wide and deserved reputation both as a non-aggressive neighbor and as a champion of worldwide peace. The Soviet policy began long before Litvinov dinned it into the ears of the League of Nations, a sounding board from which he reached the world. The first official act of the new Bolshevik government on November 8, 1917, a day after they had taken power, was, quote, to propose to all warring peoples and their governments to begin immediate negotiations for a just and democratic peace. Such a peace they described as a, quote, peace without annexations and without indemnities, a phrase later made famous by President Woodrow Wilson, who borrowed it from the Bolsheviks. I wonder how many like conspiracy theories that has spawned because he borrowed a phrase from the Bolsheviks that like Woodrow Wilson was like a secret commie or something. The fascist piece of shit he was. A standard of international justice without precedent was shown by the first actions of the young Soviet power. Its statesmen denounced and exposed the secret treaties by which Imperial Russia had agreed with Britain and France to divide the world. They annulled the unequal treaties old Russia had imposed on Turkey, Iran, and China, which divided these countries into spheres of influence of the imperialist powers. By withdrawing their armies from Iran, denouncing Tsarist claims to Constantinople, renouncing exterritoriality in China, they laid foundations for friendly relations with all these states, but they were unable to win their Anglo-French allies to the idea of, quote, peace without annexations, and were forced to sign a separate peace in which they submitted to Germany's robber demands. Even after Germany was defeated by Russia's former allies, the Allied powers themselves invaded Russia for 2.5 years. Again, just showing like the West has always been just first and foremost anti-communist, and they will make brief alliances to defeat this rising counter like competing imperialism, like actual multiple imperialisms, but they first and foremost just have to fight communism. They see it as the greatest threat. In the lowest depths of exhaustion, Lenin was even willing to agree to the splitting up of Russian territory in return for peace. The proposal made by William Christian Bullitt when he went to Moscow in March 1919 as President Wilson's semi-official representative was that the territory of Russia should be divided among all the local public governments that might be in armed possession at the moment when peace should be signed. This implied a Japanese puppet state in the Soviet Far East and British or French puppet states holding the Ukraine, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Arctic ports. Lenin agreed to this incredible holdup because the Russian people were dying by millions of starvation, pestilence, and war. Quote, we will retreat to the Urals if need be, was Lenin's decision. Even on these terms, the powers at Versailles refused to grant peace to the Bolsheviks, choosing rather to destroy them utterly. Damn, talk about like great hubristic moments in history where like if they had done that, imagine the situation that like modern day Russia would be in, the Soviet Union would have been in after that point. Oh my god, we would be in like even worse hell world. Not by appeals for peace, nor by offers of territory, but by the courage and sacrifice of the Russian people were peace and independence finally won. To the peace-hungry land of those days, real peace came very slowly. First, the cessation of actual battle, then trade agreements, then after many years, diplomatic recognition. At each stage, the strength of the new Soviet state was tested by the great capitalist powers, who were unwilling to grant it the right to exist. The USSR has the right to exist. The first administration of the young state to any international conference was at the Genoa Conference of 1922, called by the victorious Allies in the hope of dumping the burden of a bankrupt post-war Europe on the backs of Soviet Russia and vanquished Germany. The prospective victims had to be present in order to accept the burden. At this first emergence in the Councils of Nations, the Soviets made a plea for limitation of armaments. Quote, "The forces directed toward restoration of world economy," said Georges Chicherin. Let's see, there's a footnote that I'll go back to. Said Georges Chicherin, the leader of the Soviet delegation, "will be strangled as long as above Europe and above the world hangs the threat of new wars." Failing to get response to this proposal, he startled the world by signing with Germany the famous Rapallo Agreement, in which the two orphan children of the conference renewed friendly relations on the basis of equality, each canceling the other's debts. It was the first move of any nation to treat the vanquished Germany on such a basis. Had it been followed by other nations in those days when the Germans aspired toward democracy, Hitler Germany would never have arisen. Another crazy turn. Going back to this footnote here, the last invasions were in 1920 by the Poles with French assistance, and in 1920 to 21 by the Finns under Baron Mannerheim. The Japanese were not driven out of Vladivostok until October 24th, 1922. American relations with the USSR were not resumed until 1933. Crazy stuff. All right, you guys, I'm at an hour and a minute, so I will wrap it up here for the day. I'm going to go bookmark the Anna Louise Strong book, but yeah, wild stuff. Just saying, like, if other countries, all the rest of the Western powers had done what the Soviets did to the defeated Germany after World War I, then World War II would never have happened. Hitler would have never come to power to begin with. Just saying. Crazy. And also, the other huge revelation there, like the West's own hubris that they could destroy the Soviet Union entirely, prevented them from signing a deal with Lenin, where he would have reduced its size very considerably, like by what, like something like 80%? I don't even know. Crazy stuff. All right, you guys. Well, thank you again, as always, for joining. I will pick this up again tomorrow. And as always, links in the description if you want to follow along or send any of these along to people or follow ahead or